Welcome, everyone. I am Bob Wurzelbacher, the director of the Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and this is our video podcast series that we call Being Pro-Life. Each month, we'll discuss a different topic in the Respect Life arena. We'll hear personal stories from people deeply affected by those issues. And finally, we'll share ways that you can get involved. This month's topic is pro-life activities around the world. We're going to talk with people from every corner of the globe this month. So let's talk now with this week's guest. Will you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Monica Dumit. I'm the Director of Public Affairs and Engagement for the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney, which essentially means I give policy advice to the Archbishop of Sydney, Archbishop Anthony Fisher, and also act as the Archdiocesan spokeswoman.
All right, well, Monica, what's the state of abortion in Australia, and have things changed recently, and is it a big problem there?
Abortion in Australia is governed on a state-by-state basis. So for those who don't know, Australia has just 6 states and 2 territories that are governed a little bit differently. Abortion, unfortunately, is quite widespread here in Australia. It's legal in every single state, right up until birth. The only state in Australia that has a couple of restrictions is South Australia, where abortion is restricted after 28 weeks. But before then, in South Australia, there's no restrictions and pretty much no restrictions anywhere else in the country, which is really sad.
No restrictions. In the United States, we have partial birth abortion. Does that happen in Australia, or is there a restriction on that kind of procedure?
There's no restriction on partial birth abortions here. The most that's required is that you have to have 2 doctors sign off on it. But other than that, it can go through unrestricted.
Now, here in the United States, it's quite a common thing to see people praying outside of an abortion clinic. You can't even really be very near a clinic for that kind of thing. Is that right?
That's right. So in recent years in Australia, the various states have passed laws restricting people from communicating about abortion within 150 metres of an abortion clinic. So quite a fair distance. And even standing and praying the rosary silently outside an abortion clinic would still fall foul of this type of law.
So what about, like, we have this big March for Life, for example, in DC, we call it the March for Life. Can you do that in Australia, or that's not okay either?
We love the March for Life in the United States and take great heart from it. I was actually there last year. We went on a pilgrimage, and so my Archbishop Anthony Fisher came and brought a whole bunch of our young people to the March for Life. And it's now becoming an annual pilgrimage from Sydney. One of the reasons I think we do that is to give people heart. I mean, the March for Life has been going more than 40 years over in the United States, and it's my understanding that it started off quite small after Roe was passed in your Supreme Court. And the idea that there is a persistence within the pro-life community that is actually bearing great fruit, but it's taken generations of commitment. In Australia, we take a lot of heart from that from the States. We can do similar things here, again, as long as they're not within 150 metres of an abortion clinic. It's amazing what people can do when they stand up. So we've seen that on a small scale here in Sydney, and we see it on a much greater scale in the United States. And we're so thankful for that and for the example that the pro-life community in the US sets for us here.
In Australia, what's the story with assisted suicide?
2017, it was legalised in Victoria, which was the first state, and that only came into effect about 6 months ago, so June 2019. So we've got one state where euthanasia is actively occurring at the moment. We've got another state, Western Australia, where laws legalising euthanasia and assisted suicide have passed the Parliament, but there's an 18-month implementation phase. In a number of other states, there are inquiries that are happening with an attempt to bring it on. And so we're going to be fighting those battles in any number of the states, probably simultaneously. And even in this short time, we're seeing the laws get progressively weaker. So what have been touted as safeguards in Victoria were rejected in Western Australia. And then last week we saw a bill be released for consultation down in Tasmania, and that's weaker again. One example is that a person doesn't need to be terminally ill. Euthanasia is even allowed for incurable injury, so opens the door up for people who are paraplegic or something like that. So as each state goes through and attempts to draft their laws, they're getting progressively weaker. We're seeing the slippery slope in action because that's what euthanasia laws are like, right? They get their foot in the door and then progressively weaken them, and so more and more people become eligible to die.
I do want to be a little bit careful with terminology. So physician-assisted suicide is legal in several states in the United States, but not euthanasia.
Thanks for making the distinction. In the states that have legalised it so far and that are pushing to legalise it, it's both physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. There isn't a state that has or has tried to just legalise one or the other. The request still has to be made by the patient and it still has to be voluntary, but we make no distinction really in the laws between physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia.
So Monica, what are some other big issues in Respect Life going on in Australia?
Currently in Australia, surrogacy is only permitted altruistically. So that means that a mother can get reimbursed for sort of her medical and her legal expenses. But other than that, surrogacy is essentially a voluntary act. And it usually only occurs between family members or friends or people who are close. We're starting to see a push for that to be changed. Just recently in Victoria, the government introduced laws that would expand the compensation available to a surrogate mother to about 2 months' worth of lost wages, maternity clothes, and other types of things. So increasing the financial compensation available to a surrogate mother. And we're slowly seeing a push for commercial surrogacy, particularly after the legalisation of same-sex marriage. And it was something that was predictable there, because once you give people the right to get married, then the associated right is to marry and to found a family. And so particularly with homosexual male couples, the way that they would do that would be through surrogacy. You'll have stories of people going overseas and spending tens of thousands of dollars to access surrogacy over there, with the suggestion that it could just be easier if Australia just got its act together and allowed commercial surrogacy.
Surrogacy doesn't have any financial limits in the United States, I don't think.
What we see here, unfortunately, though, is that a lot of Australians will go to developing countries. I'm not sure if you guys saw the news of baby Gummy. It happened a few years ago here in Australia. And that was a couple who had sought out a surrogate mother over in Thailand. And she gave birth to a baby who had Down syndrome. And so they left the baby in Thailand and came back home and said that they didn't want it.
That's so wrong on so many fronts. If you look at this as a commercial transaction, we're just borrowing your body, and a child is created with the understanding it would be raised by a particular couple, but because of Down syndrome, the child is just seen as some kind of a defective product. That's part of what surrogacy creates, these commercial attitudes that are totally against the dignity of life in the first place. In your article, you mentioned conversion therapy. That's a big thing in the United States. If someone expresses some question about gender identity, that they're biologically male, but I believe I'm female at any age, that it would be child abuse to suggest that they might change their mind or that this might be a phase. Is it the same way in Australia? Where are we there?
Gender identity is a really big thing here, increasingly in younger children. In the last number of years, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of children presenting with gender dysphoria. Maybe about 10 years ago, a clinic at a hospital would see 2, 3 or 4 children in a year. The same clinics now see upwards of 250 or 300 children coming in with gender dysphoria. They're treating them daily. But instead of having an honest conversation about what's going on there, sort of trying to affirm the child in their biological sex and working with them to accept that and understand that, there's almost this push to, as soon as the child even presents with slightly boyish or girlish characteristics, to affirm them in that and to prohibit medical professionals from saying or doing otherwise. In certain states in Australia where they're having inquiries to ban what they call conversion therapy. Things like trying to counsel a child into maintaining their own gender, to investigating maybe what some of the social causes behind the gender dysphoria are. Anything less than affirming a change in gender could potentially be seen as illegal. So those laws thankfully haven't passed yet, but that's another one that's on the horizon for us.
Religious freedom here in the United States, that's a big thing. One of the primary things it is affected by, of course, is same-sex marriage. An example would be the idea that if someone bakes cakes, for weddings, and then there's a homosexual marriage and they want that person to work for their celebration, that person says, feel free to go to this place because I'm not willing to celebrate the idea of a homosexual marriage. And people are being sued for that. We seem to be currently in a case where religious freedoms are mostly being protected in that way. But what's that look like in Australia?
In Australia, there would be very, very limited protection, probably none for people like a cake baker, florists, photographers and things like that. At the moment, the only real protection is for churches and for church buildings. But outside of that, there's no ability for a hall that is rent it out for other purposes, a reception venue or anything like that, to decline a booking for a same-sex wedding. Nor is there the ability for somebody who is a service provider to deny service. There was a case maybe a couple of years ago. A very famous wedding photographer here was asked to do some family photos for a same-sex couple and their children. And he said to them, I'll do the photos, absolutely. If you want me to do them, I'll do them. But I should let you know that I'm a Christian and I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. And so if you would prefer to have somebody else do your photos, I think that you should have that right. And they sued him for discrimination, successfully so. In another case, a retreat centre called Christian Youth Camps declined a booking for a camp for LGBT teens that would, among other things, promote sort of sexual activity and experimentation, and they were successfully sued for discrimination. And so it's really, really difficult for any type of commercial business to enjoy protections when it comes to speaking out on traditional marriage.
How can we help the pro-life movement in Australia as well, or other parts of the world?
I think that the best thing that you can do for the pro-life movement in Australia is keep fighting the fight where you are, in the United States or wherever you're listening from. If you keep fighting strongly, then you're giving us great witness and great example.
Well, Monica, thanks for talking to us today about all the issues going on in Australia, some of the big Respect Life issues. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for tuning in on this episode of our Being Pro-Life series. Head to the website and view all the links talked about in this episode at www.catholiccincinnati.org/being-pro-life. Thank you again for joining us today, and I look forward to being with you next time.